Okay, well, good morning. We are going to be continuing our series on Revelation, and this is going to be the first of our two sessions on the letter to Thyatira, the history and background of Thyatira. But before we get there, we just know that because we can't have our local congregation together, we wanted to put a graphic up on the screen. That's just going to show you some people are comfortable giving online via the Learn More button that is on our Facebook page. That'll take you to our giving portal. So you can click that at any time you want, set up giving via credit card or debit card. But if you're a little old-fashioned or just a little uncomfortable doing that over the internet, you can send your offering checks to us directly. The address on your screen, Rainmaker Ministries, 4138 Huntington Drive, Traverse City, Michigan, 49686. So just know we appreciate you continuing to support us in this time of national crises, because to be here and to continue to stream, to bring content to you, no matter where you're at around the world, there's still expenses to that, and we're by no means in crisis mode. We're by no means in a panic. God is taking care of us, but your continued support is what enables us to continue to bring this kind of content to you, because the bills don't stop just because people can't come to the local congregation. So that said, that's all we want to talk about that. Let's dive in to the history and background of the letter to Thyatira. Now, we do need to do a little bit of review. I'm not going to engage in too much review, but there are a few things worth noting. I just want to remind people, especially at this time, when there's crises going on, COVID-19 all over the world, people think of that word apocalypse as something that means the end of the world, the cataclysm. And that's not what apocalypsis, the Greek word from which we get our word comes from, means. 19 times as a noun, it means to unveil or to uncover. As a verb, 21 times, it simply means to reveal. And because John entitled his book The Revelation, singular, one revelation, not more than one, the revelation of Jesus Christ, well, it's called the unveiling or the revealing of Jesus Christ. It doesn't matter that Ricky Bobby from Talladega Nights thought that he could worship little baby Jesus, or that some people identify with the Jesus on their crucifix, or the itinerant rabbi Jesus that spoke in parables. The Jesus that exists now is the Jesus from the vision that John had in Revelation chapter 1, eyes like fire, feet like brass, voice like the waters, the impressive Jesus that is going to return someday to the Mount of Olives and take his rightful place to rule the nation with a rod of iron in Israel. That's Jesus as he exists in this moment, seated tentatively at the edge of his Father's throne in heaven, waiting to take his throne, the throne of David, in the near future. Do not be afraid, because apocalypse should mean something where we are excited to see our Jesus as he really is, not through a glass darkly, but face to face. That's what a study of Revelation should do for us. Now, we are in a portion of this book that, according to the outline the Apostle John gives us, he said, write the things which you have seen. That was the vision of Christ in chapter 1. And he said, and the things which are, that's chapters 2 and 3, the 7 churches that presently existed in his time. And then the things which shall be hereafter, that which follows after the churches, which is chapters 4 through 22. The reason we know these were real churches in real cities that existed at the time that John wrote was because of the work of this guy, an archaeologist by the name of Sir WM Ramsay, who lived in the 19th to early 20th centuries. He became so overwhelmingly convinced as an atheist archaeologist. That's fun to say, try it twice. Atheist archaeologist. He converted to Christianity based on the accuracy, historical and otherwise, of the Bible's accounts that Luke wrote from Asia Minor and that John wrote specifically concerning Revelation 2 and 3. Now, there are 4 levels of application, and we say that the first level is the local application of these 7 letters. They serve as a foundation. And I haven't touched on this as much, and I really thought I should. Why go to so much depth on 2 chapters of the book? Well, because it's very easy to start thinking that all of the audacious, outlandish, incredible, perhaps fantastical stuff that we're going to see in chapters 4 through 22 is a fairy tale. But when one has taken the time to break down these 7 letters, go letter by letter, church by church, and you see how grounded in reality they are, you see how incredibly real the letters were to the history and times and nature and places of these 7 churches, and the seriousness with which Jesus took to write and address these specific 7 churches when there were over 100 or at least 100 other churches in the known world during the time of John's writing, it grounds the book of Revelation in an overwhelming sense of reality. And that's what we're trying to do. Because when you see, I realize that it's condensed. It's only 2 chapters out of 22 chapters total. But the height, breadth, depth, width, expanse of the foundation in reality that we are laying with these letters and the multiple levels of application that it has for our lives should impress upon you, me, everyone within the sound of my voice to not take this book lightly. Remember, there's a blessing promised to those who read and keep the words of this prophecy, the prophecy in Revelation. So, that said, that's why we're working so hard to lay this foundation. Now, Ephesus was warned it would have to deal with grievous wolves, and a spirit of Antichrist. But in so doing, they forsook their first love. They got so busy in heresy hunting, love and hope were the casualties. Where is their lampstand today? Well, of course, it's been removed. Ephesus is now miles from the sea, unapproachable by ship. What was a major harbor is now a marsh dense with reeds. What once was a key city in Asia is now in desolation. How about the Smyrnian church? Well, they knew the cost of following Christ. Smyrna was once destroyed, but never again. Today, the city thrives. Christians outnumbered those that would persecute them. They weren't afraid to give up comfort for his name. And the Pergamanian church, well, they were exhorted by the right of the sword to not just have devotion or doctrine like Ephesus was, not just endure persecution like Smyrna was, but to purify their ambassadorship. And so we're come to a place where we want to understand what these first 3 churches admonish us to do. We're told to hear what the Spirit says to the churches. And the letters are like a report card. Any church anywhere can be mapped based on them. Don't forsake your first love. Endure persecution. And what's on the inside better be what comes out when you're crushed. Now, the personal application of these letters so far has been that we need to be not neglect our priorities. We need to be salt and light. We need to overcome satanic opposition. We need to avoid spiritual compromise. There is a prophetic profile to all of this. And that shows us that these 7 churches, if they had any different names, if they were presented to us in any different order, or if Christ had chosen any of the other 93 some churches, Jerusalem, Antioch, Colossae, Philippi, any of those other churches that existed at the time of the writing of the Revelation, this would not be possible. It would indeed not be true. But because of the 7 churches chosen and the order in which Christ chose to present them to us, we see that the book of Acts covers the first 30 years of church history. But Ephesus takes the church from the apostolic period, from the close of the book of Acts to the close of the first century AD when John was writing. Smyrna is the persecuted church, during 250 years of persecution at the hands of 10 cruel and vicious Roman emperors. The close of Acts through Constantine, we see that beginning. Pergamus then becomes the married church. Constantine decides to make Christianity legal, and he issues the Edict of Toleration in 312 AD. And that continues to, I say, about 440, maybe about 600 AD, when we enter the medieval period. That's the next phase for church history. Let's very quickly review the homework you were assigned for the last couple of weeks. You needed to read chapters 2 and 3 of Revelation. And each time that I reassign this to you, please, 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 read it again with the new information that you've garnered from the sessions that we're doing. So when you get that assignment again after this session and the following session, read those 2 and 3 chapters again with the knowledge that has now been given to you so you can expand and unpack and really build for yourself the foundation I was talking about a few minutes ago. You needed to outline the letter to Thyatira looking for those 7 distinctives, those 7 key elements that are in each of the 7 letters to the 7 churches. The name of the church, the title of Christ chosen, the commendation or you're doing good that Jesus gives to the church, the concern, you're not doing so hot at this, the exhortation, do better at this or else, and the promise to those who indeed overcome, followed, of course, by that last element, the line, he that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. Now, I gave you one other assignment, which is very important for the upcoming session. That was to read 1 Kings chapter 21 and answer yourself the question, who was Jezebel? Don't forget to do that. In fact, if you haven't done it, pause this video right now and take the time to study that. Okay, so that was your homework. One of the other things that we took the time to do, and it is in a separate session, was to do an addendum, a review of the papacy, the popes, the chief representatives, if you will, of the church for the medieval period. Why did we take the time to do that? Because there is a lot of history there that the average Christian just simply doesn't know. We're not taught it in our schools, we're not taught it in our churches, and sometimes we're not even taught it in our seminaries or our Bible schools. Take the time, if you haven't, between this session and next session to at least review that information. It is available there to you for a reason, because it will help you understand the prophetic profile of the church at Thyatira. We didn't want to burden you down here with it. We recorded it separately, but we want you to have access to it. We want you to take the time to go through it. We've also even created some documentation so you can read it, study it, know it, inform yourself. Remember, God is a rewarder of those who diligently seek Him. Sometimes you have to eat your vegetables. Sometimes you have to do the homework. All right. So with that said, we're going to dive into this church, the letter to the church at Thyatira. We're going to look at their history and background so we can understand where this church came from. What was the city that it was based in? As always, we'll begin by asking ourselves, where was Thyatira? Well, like the other churches, it was located in the Roman province of Asia Minor. And Asia Minor, of course, is not Asia as we recognize the term Asia today, meaning it is not the former Soviet Union, it is not China, it is not India. No, Asia to the Romans meant the western portion of what modern-day world citizens would call Turkey. As we have seen, Ephesus was right on the eastern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, and Smyrna existed just a few miles north of that. Headed further north still, we would have come to the city of Pergamum, and then the red dot on your screen, a little bit east, is the city of Thyatira. In its post-Persian times, the city was converted into a frontier fortress, guarding from invaders to the east the way to the much more populated city of Pergamus. So that's its geographic position. Of course, Thyatira was possibly next to Philadelphia, the least, the smallest of all the 7 churches. Let's look at its history. Much of Thyatira's early history is lost to the ages. There is not as much archaeologically or as much historically that we can glean, but we're going to tell you what we do know. First, it was originally a Lydian town bearing the name of Pelopia, but that name didn't stick around too long. Then it caught another name, the name Semiramis, and that's going to be one you're going to want to jot down. That's going to be very, very key in our application of the letter, which you will discover why in the next session. And then it had the name Euhippia for a little while, but it was taken by the Persians and existed under their rule for the duration of their empire. And then Alexander the Great, it fell to him during his conquest of Persia, but remained just a town of no significance. After that, it fell into the possession of one of Alexander's successors. He had 4 generals that succeeded him, and as did much of Asia Minor, Thyatira fell into the possession of General Lysimachus. Now, in 301 BC, Lysimachus was defeated by another of Alexander the Great's generals, one by the name of Seleucus. He was also known as Nictator, and the city became part of Syria. Now, in 301 BC, Nictator renamed the city, Thyatira, which comes from the Greek Thygator, and he named that for his daughter because he was with Lysimachus, received word from his wife that he had had a daughter, and so he renamed the city in honor of having had a daughter, and that's how it got the name Thyatira. For the first time in its beleaguered history, the city experiences a period of peace under Roman rule. And now today, the road from Istanbul, or what used to be Constantinople, to Izmir, what used to be Smyrna, runs through the small and unattractive town of Akhisar. It has a population of about 30,000 people, which now occupies the site where once stood the important military city that John would have known as Thyatira. So what's in a name? Just to recap, the city was originally called Pelopia. It's changed to the name Semiramis, a name with great historical world religious meaning. It gets renamed again to Euhippia and then becomes named by Nictator I, Thyatira, after he has a daughter. Much of what we know about the city was that it was one of a growing increase in commercial importance. This is kind of interesting because when Jesus gives the church there a commendation, he names 6 things that they're doing well and says they are improving. Well, the city, if you want to take the city apart from the church, the city itself was doing several things well, and it was improving. It was growing from being more than just a beleaguered military fortress. The city developed for itself more trade guilds than any other Asian city in ancient Rome. We can see from many inscriptions, we'll look at a few more on a different slide in just a minute, from their coinage, that there were trade guilds for wool workers, linen workers, makers of outer garments. There were dyers. We'll talk about that more in just a moment. Leather workers, tanners, potters, slave dealers, and then the most well-known guild within the city was those that dealt with bronze or brass. The bronze or brass smiths were probably the most important guild within the city. They were very, very recognized for what they did. Now, as a citizen and somebody who wanted to be a tradesman, somebody who wanted to earn a living in Thyatira, they had to join one of these guilds. Membership in these guilds was compulsory. These guilds were well organized. They were corporate bodies providing specific benefits, taking actions to protect their interests, and owning considerable property. Each guild was under the patronage of some pagan deity or another. And all of the proceedings and feasts commenced with paying homage to the pagan deity of your guild. This, of course, presented a dilemma for Christian tradesmen in the city because a Christian can't compromise their values. They can't pay homage to a pagan god, a dumb, deaf idol of stone or wood or what have you. They have to pay homage to the one true ruler of the universe, Jesus Christ, and his Father who sent him. But that, as we saw when it came to the Smyrnians and the emperor worship that they refused to give over to, that was a surefire way to begin to find persecution and stick out like a sore thumb. So that highlights the dilemma of the modern Christian business person. Do we compromise our faith to succeed in business? Or do we hold fast to our values, denying ourselves easy opportunities that non-believers wouldn't flinch at? My dad had an opportunity like that. I thought about mentioning he was once offered a contract to do all the tow trucks for the city of Flint, and all he had to do was take the opportunity, and he said, "No, I can't do that. I can't do that because it means I would have had to have employees that worked on Sundays," and he just could not, in his faith, run a business that caused people to have to work on the seventh day when God gave us a command to rest. So he had to turn a very lucrative opportunity down. I remember that from my childhood. Do we compromise in that sense for our own gain? Now, one of the things, we mentioned the dying guild, the guild of dyes. This is an evidence for the Bible's accuracy because Lydia, mentioned in Acts 16, 14 through 15, was apparently a member of one of Thyatira's many trade guilds. She was a traveling sales rep for Thyatira, and she traded in what the Bible calls purple. More than likely, it was either a scarlet or a blue, the scarlet being derived from the madder root, which is prolific in the area, or from the murex, which is a shellfish that has in its throat a drop of dye could be extracted from its secretions. So Lydia was known to be wealthy in the Bible. She is a rep for this dye guild, a merchant of purple, the Bible calls her, and she's dwelling in the city of Philippi in Acts 16. Now, maybe she was there just conducting business, or maybe she was there because it was easier for her to live in the city of Philippi than to be right under the guild's thumb in Thyatira because of her Christian faith. We don't know. So Thyatira portrays the medieval papacy from about 600 to 1500 AD if we look at the historic or the prophetic profile that we've been examining in this series. The dream to establish and enforce the pretensions of the Roman Church constitute the major part of church history throughout the Middle Ages. The Chaldean priest who interpreted the esoteric doctrines of the Babylonian Mysteries was called Peter, i.e., the interpreter. He wore an insignia of the two keys of Janus and Cybele, which still appear on the papal arms as symbols of spiritual authority all the way to this day. We see paganism that got merged when the church married the world in Pergamus, and then as compromise seeps in Thyatira, we begin to see these things continue. And you can see the vestments of, interestingly enough, Roman Catholics today, they have purples and scarlets that came from what the priestly garbs of the pagans were from these esoteric Babylonian mysteries, it's been carried down throughout the ages. There's no biblical call for a priest of the Christian faith to ever wear a red vestment or ever wear a purple vestment. Where did that come from? We see some of those roots here. So, just a little bit of history. The danger to the church at Thyatira did not arise from the persecutions of Rome, like it did for the Smyrnians, nor from the animosity of Jewish attitudes, like it did for the church of Ephesus in the apostolic period before it. It arose from within the church itself, which was all the more serious and difficult to deal with. When it comes to the geography of Thyatira, we don't have as much to report. There are just some ruins there to this day, but we were able to find and excavate coinage from that time. Here's a rendering of the city quite a while ago. Here are some of the ruins of the architecture at that time, and if you were there on an archaeological investigative journey, you would see the modern village in the distance, and yet here are some of the ruins of the ancient city that survive to this day. These are the kinds of things, obviously the modern city wasn't quite that built up, but these are some of the things that WM Ramsay would have seen on his journey. Here's another picture. You can see the modern city way off in the background, and yet much of the ancient city still exists with its columns and its walls that exist today. So what we know of the religion of Thyatira comes from its coins and its inscriptions, things that we were able to extract through archaeological research. We know that this gentleman that we see here on this coin was the hero Tyrimnos, and he is closely related in nature to the god of Thyatira. Like the city itself, he had many names over the years. He was once called Propator because his temple was at the front of the city. Propolis, the chief ancestor of the city, and some more familiar names, Helios, the sun god, and Pythian, Tyrimnian, Apollo, Apollo being yet another sun god. So the names show the various cultural segments of the city, finding syncretism as the city evolved into one cohesive unit as it moved through its beleaguered history. Now, all of that said, remember what Constantine accomplished in his day. Constantine appointed himself the head of the Christian church when he declared Christianity legal in 312 AD. But he also had large groups of people across the empire who were sun god, Helios, or Apollo worshipers. And one of the things he did was appoint Sunday as the day for the worship of both, because Christians worshiped on the first day of the week because they celebrated the resurrection of Jesus Christ, and sun god worshipers worshiped on the first day of the week because it was Sunday. That's where it got its name. They were celebrating the sun. 2 emperors later, when Theodosius decided he was going to go one better than Constantine did, not just making Christianity legal, he decided to make Christianity the de facto state religion, and instantly, by force of fiat, not convicted repentance, declared every one of those pagan sun god worshiping priests, now Christian pastors, every one of those pagan sun god worshiping temples, Christian churches. It immediately caused a marriage between the church and the world, where unregenerate sinners were now called Christians, but they never experienced repentance or rebirth through the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ. Here are a couple more of the coins, renderings from coins rather, that we saw demonstrating this god, Tyrimnos, Helios, Apollo, on their coinage in various ways. Now, I say all of that just to bring a reminder to you about the migrating priesthood and what we began to study when we looked at the church of Pergamus. What I mean by that is Nimrod founds the Babylonian religion. And the Babylonian religion, in effect, was a religion that had to do with his mama. Or actually his wife and his son. So that's where it gets confusing, because you have Nimrod as the head and founder of the religion, but Semiramis has a halo or sun disk around his head, and Semiramis remember the name of the city, was Nimrod's wife. She has a son named Tammuz, and they become a mother-daughter, and then, of course, Nimrod dies, so they become husband and wife, this confusing, incestuous relationship that they have. And if you really study the Babylonian religion, Tammuz dies and is supposed to be resurrected. That is actually what we have here with the Babylonian legend of the Yule log that became one of our Christian supposed celebrations. Well, that was part of the Babylonian Nimrod, Semiramis, Tammuz religion. They would burn that log, and when the log died, it was part of the resurrection experience. In fact, the reason that they did that is they brought coniferous trees into their home as part of their celebration and decorated them, and then the Yule log symbolizes the death and rebirth of Tammuz. There's also Christianized pagan things that come out of Easter, et cetera, et cetera. The point of this session isn't to devolve into all of that, because they're sessions on their own. I could go into lots of extemporaneous details, but what you witness in that happening, what you witness in that happening is, if you go back to Babylon, you see Nimrod founds a religion about his wife and his son, Semiramis and Tammuz. And of course, as I said, Semiramis and Tammuz become lovers. Well, then Phoenicia takes on Ashtoreth and Tammuz. And of course, the high god over it all, Nimrod, becomes Baal. And if you read the Old Testament, you know God and Elijah, they didn't think too much about Baal and Ashtoreth. Then in Egypt, the mythology is renamed yet again. It becomes Isis and Horus. And then in Greece, it becomes renamed again. It becomes Aphrodite and Eros. And then in Rome, it becomes Venus and Cupid. We see this again and again. And so, as I pointed out when we were starting the study of Pergamus, we have this migrating priesthood. From Nimrod, it comes, but then Cyrus comes and conquers Babylon. You would know about that from studying the story of the handwriting on the wall in Daniel, when Nebuchadnezzar's grandson actually sees the writing on the wall, and they call for Daniel, and Daniel says, "You're going to be conquered." And that's when the Persians conquer all of Babylon. Well, the priests and initiates of that Babylonian religion, they leave, they set up shop in Pergamus. And remember, Thyatira became a military city designed to protect Pergamus from invaders from the east. It was the bastion on the wall, the watchtower, to protect that temple of Zeus that ultimately gets erected in Pergamus and therefore becomes the throne of Satan, Jesus called it in the letter to Pergamus. So then when Rome rises to power, the religion becomes known as the Etruscan Mysteries, and it moves from Pergamus all the way to Rome, and that's where it gets embedded into Rome itself and the Roman mythology that takes place there, and that is how we see it become entwined with Christianity when Constantine and Theodosius decide that they're going to make Christianity legal, and then they're going to make it the state religion and force convert all of those priests into pastors and temples into churches. Long story, but that impacts us today, as you can see in our Christmas traditions, as you can see in our Easter rabbit traditions and Easter eggs. In fact, that very term Easter is the Babylonian name for Ishtar. Ishtar is, once again, Semiramis. You can hear it in the Phoenician, Astarte, Astoreth, Ishtar. The name changes a bit, but the same deity, the same worship continues. So, weakness is made strong. And what I mean by this is where the church was strong in its biblical doctrine, when we started out with Ephesus, we see that bad doctrines crept into the church, and what Ephesus was praised for avoiding, identifying antichrist spirits and avoiding them. By the time we get to Thyatira, antichrist teachings, anti-biblical teachings, traditions of world religions become intermixed with Christianity. And weakness begins to bear strength. And one of the reasons that we take the time to do things like the addendum on the papacy that we did and the history, and we try to paint this picture for you, is because understanding the background to this church helps to answer very important questions when it comes to sharing your faith, especially with non-believers. And I want to make sure that I cover this in this session just as a reminder. History teaches us that we learn nothing from history. When we're defending our faith, we need to be able to answer atheist objections. And one that I get all the time is that organized religion, aka Christianity, is responsible for some of the greatest atrocities in history. And we covered some of those in that crash course on the history of the papacy that we covered. The Albigenses wiped out, the Waldenses wiped out, the Huguenots wiped out. The Catholic Church comes to a place where all of a sudden the church is persecuting people who want to have a closer relationship with God, but it sees them as violating church tradition, and therefore, in order to stamp out the threat to a pagan priesthood, a temporal power priesthood, they have to kill these people. And the church actually kills millions of Christians. And then we have the Crusades in the churches killing Muslims. And non-believers want answers to the questions, well, why is your religion any different than other religions in the world? Why is it different than a bunch of terrorist jihadis who want to kill people for not believing what they believe? And the answer is biblical Christianity does not force convert anyone. There is no biblical motive to force anyone to become a Christian. In fact, the book of Acts shows very different behaviors on the Acts of the Apostles. When Jesus first sent out the disciples 2 by 2, he said, go into each city, preach the good news. If they receive you, fantastic. If they don't, kick the dust off your feet and move on. Just move on. Jesus in John 12, verse 47 through 48 says, even those who don't believe me, I do not judge them. Because those who don't believe me already have what will judge them. My word will judge them in the last day. Christians don't need to judge people living in adultery. Christians don't need to judge people that are committing acts of homosexuality. Now, there's one dividing line on that we need to make sure we mark. We have to judge what happens in the church of God. We have to judge what takes place within inside the church, because people who are claiming to be Christians that are not living up to the name and nature of Christ, that are not doing what Jesus said in the Great Commission, which is go into all the world, make disciples, and to teach them to obey all things that I've commanded you, that's not a Christian for real. That's like squeezing an apple and getting orange juice. But if you squeeze an apple, you should get cider. And that's exactly what started to happen when people were forced converted in the 3rd or 4th century. We want to protect genuine Christianity within the church, but people outside, but people who are outside the church, we don't place them under judgment. We minister the simplicity of the gospel. We minister the love of Christ. If they receive it, we rejoice with them. If they don't receive it, we move on and we pray that God would send other laborers into their harvest field, because forcing people to be Christians led to one of the worst periods in human history and some of the worst atrocities the world has ever known at the hands of the Roman Catholic Church. My Catholic friends, I'm sorry if that offends you, but it's just historical fact. And it doesn't work. So when an atheist blames organized religious for those atrocities, what is our answer? The institutional church was responsible for those things, But biblical Christianity has always resisted the church's intermarriage with the world. They resisted it then. Godly believers left the institutional church then. They became monks and monastics. They decried the vile things that the hierarchy of the church was doing, and they were persecuted for it. And today, Christians do the same thing. If a church is not doing what it ought to be doing, we recognize that you can't change an organization from the bottom up. The only option you have is to vote with your feet. And we stand up for the Word of God, and we contend earnestly for the faith. But just because organized religion was responsible for atrocities does not mean that biblical, historic, real Christianity was ever in favor of those things. In fact, all of those who were Bible believers were not. We fought it tooth and nail historically. And that's an important distinction to be able to make, and that's why we show you so much of this history. So that said, let's look at a few things about the history and background of the church at Thyatira to have in your head before we go to the next session. First off, Thyatira was originally named Semiramis. Secondly, Thyatira was one of the weakest and smallest of the 7 cities, much like the original church was weak and small, and it met in house to house. But then there was a change, and suddenly the church was in the most fortified, beautiful, ornate buildings that the world could offer. Tyrimnos was a carryover from those Babylonian mysteries. Thyatira is known for its commerce. Chief among its guilds was that brass smith's guild. That's going to be key when we start to apply the letter in the next session. It bounced from ruler to ruler amidst the warring kings of Asia Minor. You know what's interesting about that? You're going to see, if you go watch that session we did on the church history, the popes did the same thing. They bounced from ruler to ruler amidst warring kings. And there were times when the popes were instrumental in appointing kings, and there were times where kings were instrumental in appointing popes. And its conquerors had no choice but to refortify it every time. To make it stronger, to make it bigger, to make it more entrenched in its traditions and in its religion and in its values. So that's the Thyatira recap. That is the history and background of this church. And in the next session, we will apply verse by verse Revelation chapter 2, Jesus' letter to the church at Thyatira, and see what those 4 levels, local, admonitory, personal, and prophetic, mean for us as we continue to lay down our foundation to the book of Revelation. We'll see you next time.